The mists off Shipbreaker Bay crept inland at dawn, pale ribbons curling through the trampled grasses and the guy ropes of pavilions that glimmered like dew-jeweled beetle shells under the first light. The sea spoke with its endless, iron patience beyond the curve of land. But this morning, the camp's louder voice was leather creaking and steel whispering from sheaths, the brittle laughter of men content to pretend they did not smell the storm in the air. Pennons hung limp in the stillness, and the faint smoke of sleeping cook-fires braided with the mist. On the low swell of ground where Renly Baratheon had planted his great green and gold pavilion, the scent was roses and oil. Every buckle, every bridle, every hinge had been polished till it could capture a face like a mirror. The camp showed its lord the way a faithful hound presents a stick, eager, extravagant, determined to be noticed. Catelyn Stark had learned to pay attention to what men did when they believed they were not being watched. In the yards behind the fine tents, squires knelt by buckets, rubbing down horses that had been ridden to white foam the day before. The boys' hands ran quick along withers and haunches, practiced in strokes compact as prayer. A farrier's hammer rang in the distance. Even it sounded festive, as though it were clapping hands. She drew her cloak closer and felt the cool wet against her cheeks, and for a heartbeat she was a girl again, standing with her sister on the windy wall walk at Riverrun while the river threw off mist, hearing her father's voice. "Keep your eyes. The world will give itself away to a patient watcher." They brought her to Renly while he was being laced into his armor, the green enameled plates catching weak light like deep water. He smiled in the easy, confiding manner that had charmed so many lords, though there was a tightness at the corners of his mouth that suggested he had slept less well than he claimed. His antlered helm lay beside him on a stool, a crown more honest than gold. "Lady Stark," he said, and the formal lines of courtesy were well worn between them by now. "I would have you stand as witness again. It seems my brother means to surprise me forever." She had not yet asked what the surprise would be, but she had learned too that Renly liked to appear to answer questions before they were asked. It made a performance of intimacy. "Your Grace," she said, with that small bite of irony that he never seemed to taste. "You have word of his movements?" "I have word of his intentions," Renly said, and his eyebrows leapt upward in that showman's arch. "Do not look so grim, my lady. It is a seven-faced land. Perhaps today we shall see how many faces it can make at once." Ser Loras Tyrell, who had been adjusting a strap with more care than it needed, looked up at that. He wore green as well, but his was a subtler thing than Renly's festival armor. A sleek skin of steel, close-fitted and deadly. "He will come to bend the knee," he said, without turning the statement into a question. "The longer he waits, the less there will be left of him to pick up when this is done." "We are not yet done," Catelyn said. She kept her voice level, a flat surface over deep water. "We are always nearer done than we think," said another voice, and Catelyn turned to find Brienne of Tarth standing in the opening of the tent. The blue of her cloak had the fresh bloom of a clear noon sky, which was its own sort of challenge against the sallow morning. She had, Catelyn thought, not slept at all. Some men sleep inside their armor. Brienne seemed to sleep inside her duty. "You see," Renly said, his eyes warm with approval, "I am beset with prophets today, and yet—" He glanced away, toward the aperture of the tent, where a patch of mist glowed like a pearl, and a new tension drew the corners of his mouth. "Yet the prophets do not agree." There was noise outside, the crisscrossing sound of men shifting formed lines, shouted addresses floating in the haze. A herald's trumpet sounded, clear and not too prideful, as if it apologized for drawing breath. Renly's mouth softened again into that consecutive charm, and with a gracious wave that always reminded her unwelcome of Robert at his best, he lifted his helm and set it down upon his head. When the antlers rose he became taller, wilder, some other thing kissed by the idea of a stag. He took up his gauntlets and slid them on, flexing his fingers, and said, "Lady Stark, I know you love pageant less than wisdom, but this is a country men will not follow unless you show them banners. Come and see what my brother has brought." They went out into the light, such as it was. The mists were beginning to thinning as the sea breeze discovered its strength. Gusts ran low along the ground like swift animals. The colors of the camp stirred, shook themselves, remembered their purpose. On the far edge of the trampled field, where the grass sloped toward the dark timber of the greenwood, Catelyn saw the men from Dragonstone set their ranks. It was not a large party, and they were not beautiful. The pennons there were fewer and of older cloth, and the men held them with a seriousness that made Catelyn think of tombs. She saw no great roses, no sunbursts, no other ornaments. What there was a wooden standard with a painted heart of fire upon it, and the sight of that set a murmur going through the ranks of Renly's men like wind through wheat. Stannis Baratheon rode forward with a neat economy of movement. He had a soldier's seat and a soldier's armor. Plain, brutal, honest. The jaw everyone remarked upon was clenched, but Catelyn watched the eyes, because that was where truth lived. The truth in his eyes was the exacting memory of ledgers, a mind balancing accounts. With him rode Ser Davos Seaworth, whose modest surcoat was stamped with a small black ship, and another man, tall, lean, whiskered, whom Catelyn thought she should know. More came on behind them, men whose faces she did not, and whose names she would learn and then fold away, because names too were a ledger, and a lady's life had taught her how to keep one. Among them was a woman robed in red whose hair seemed, even in this dim light, to find its own gleam. The red woman's horse moved with a priest's calm, and the men around her did not look at her directly, the way men refused to look at the sun. They rode to a measured space that had been marked by stakes and ropes, a simple place drawn upon the earth by the will to order violence. The air smelled of grass bruised by boots. Renly rode to meet his brother, and when they both stopped, they were an arm's length apart. The men behind them, one camp and the other, stood like statues with the patience of those who know the first movement will be the one everyone remembers later. "Brother," Renly said. His voice made something of the word. It made it a jest, a challenge, an invitation. "Come to me, and I will end this with a kiss." Stannis's horse shifted a hoof. "Words thin with repetition," he said. "So do jests." "Then we shall be brief," Renly said, tilting his horned helm in the smallest courtly bow. "You will protect the realm by bending the knee to its rightful king." "I am doing so," Stannis said. "I bend no knee to usurpers." He lifted his chin a finger's breadth, and the muscles moved there with a little twitch that was almost angry and almost amused. "I have come to make a thing plain, before the men who will have to die for it if we fail. I do not say your claim was made in malice. I say it is false. I say the gods take notice." Renly smiled. "Which gods? Yours has but one face, and he seems ill-inclined to share the stage. The law of these 7 kingdoms is older than both of us," Stannis said, and his voice had the flat iron sound of a nail being driven true. "It recognizes the judgment of the gods by trial. When the matter is great, the old books call for trial by 7. I call for it." There was a ripple then, a tearing sound in the camp's smooth surface. Some men laughed, some hissed out breath in surprise. More looked to the Septons who had been brought here by Renly to decorate his court, to bless his meat and his purchases, to make his cause look like a sacred feast. The fat old Septon with the yellowed beard that Catelyn had seen holding court by the great pavilion earlier, Septon Orell, she remembered now, stood with his hands working in his sleeves as if kneading dough. "Trial," Renly said, tasting it, turning it on his tongue. He was too careful an actor to betray surprise. "You call for the 7, then? You, who have set new fires on Dragonstone and burned old gods." The red woman's horse moved closer, and her lips parted as if to speak, but Stannis lifted one gloved hand, and she was still. Catelyn watched that with attention. "You will have less cause to question the gods' will if it favors you," Stannis said to Renly. "Do not pretend you would scruple to accept victory because it came by a form you disdained yesterday." Loras leaned forward. "His grace will not be instructed by." Renly put up a hand and Loras bit the words off. He turned the antlers toward his brother, and though Catelyn could not see his eyes beneath the visor, she knew how they would look, bright as coins. "There is no court to call this trial," he said. "No accusation to answer that would be satisfied by it. We are kings. The law does not cease to apply when a man calls himself king, Stannis said. The charge is usurpation. The court is all these gathered here, and the gods we pretend to honor when we take bread and salt and swore fealty to Robert. We shall name 6 companions each, and if the gods love your cause more than mine, you will have me bound to yours. If they do not, he moved his chin again. You will take off that mockery from your head, give up this play acting, and return to the place the gods and our father meant you to keep. Storm's End, Renly said softly, with the first graverness Catelyn had heard in him since she came to his camp. His gloved fingers made a little rubbing motion on the hindplate of his thigh, a thought happening in his hand. He was, she saw, alive to the pageant of the thing. The 7, the very number that spoke equal parts piety and romance to these men. The ancient rite that had only survived by becoming a story. To refuse would be to announce the story did not matter. And Renly's talent was knowing how much it mattered. His mouth smiled. A trial then. I consent. There was a small hiss of surprise from Loras, quickly turned into a cough. There was a groan of satisfaction from somewhere among the Stormlords behind Renly. There was a low, frankly audible prayer from a few men in Stannis' party whose hands were not quite steady. The Red Woman sat motionless, but her eyes had not left Stannis' face. Tomorrow at first light, Renly said, with a flair for the dramatic even here, when the entire camp was already watching. At the field before the old godswood, where the ground is level and the view is good. Septon Orell, you will bless the trial. Let the 7 see their work. Septon Orell, who had the look of a man who had expected his day to pass with roast beef and sweet wine, bobbed his head with a vigor that caused his jowls to wobble. I shall, your grace, the warrior guide your hand, and the father judge us both, Stannis said, and turned his horse without flourish, the movement as minimal as the thought that preceded it. He rode back into the gray like a page torn from a book and carried away on the wind. When they had gone, when you could no longer pretend to be watching the backs of the riders instead of the faces of the men around you, the camp remembered its voice. Orders swelled. Steel rasped in 1,000 places. Men in seamed leather and men in gilded mail began the dance they always danced. Fetching, polishing, testing, laughing. Laughter always sounded. Wildest closest to fear, Catelyn stood alone for a little while, though no one ever truly stood alone in a camp like this. She had been present at more treaties than she cared to recall, and at fewer duels. She had seen the bravery of men in groups, which was the bravery of geese. This felt like something else. This felt like men building a stage because they had secretly grown afraid of their lines in the next act. She found Brienne by one of the stakes where the field had been measured. A sensible choice of ground, the kind a soldier would prefer, and stood beside her. He is brave, Catelyn said, not certain whether she meant Renly or Stannis. Brienne's eyes were on the far-off dragonmen. Bravery is a word men use when they cannot bear that something is necessary. You think this necessary? I think it might keep more men alive to die later, Brienne said in a tone without impatience. If we had done the old thing first, fewer men would need to do the new thing. An old thing, Catelyn said, and there was a small smile at her mouth that she did not let Brienne see because she felt it was unbecoming in a woman of her age. But not so old, is it? I have heard a story of a hedge knight and a prince with a taste for cruelty. That trial ended with wiser men than princes. I wonder if we have any of those here. Brienne did not answer, and Catelyn did not press her. The sea sounded again, like a massive animal exhaling in sleep. Somewhere, Septon Orell cleared his throat with noisy, frightened fastidiousness. Catelyn closed her eyes and saw a wooden Septon Winterfell, with its 7 candles, and her husband kneeling, and could not say whether the memory was comfort or pain. Davos Seaworth had never learned to love the way sea mists made everything taste clean and rotten at once. He knew what it was to be carried and to drown, and mist was the sea not yet remembered. When he dismounted, he glanced toward the Red Woman and saw that, for once, she was watching someone else. The men of Dragonstone were pleased and scared by turns, depending on how large they imagined the gods and how small they imagined their own bellies. Ser Axel Florent, bony and earnest in his oiled mail, was flushed with zeal. Lord Montfort Valerion looked as if he had awakened to discover the deck was slipping under his feet and was determined not to vomit. Sir Richard Horp wore his habitual expression, which was to say none at all. And Godry Faring, Godry the Giant Slayer, he liked to be called, though Davos had never heard of any giant being involved, was already drinking, but more to wet his temper than drown it. Stannis removed his gauntlets himself, liking neither assistance nor the appearance of needing it. He handed them to Davos without looking at him and said, "We will need 6. You, of course," Davos said carefully, because in some things certainty soothed Stannis and in some it pricked him. Sir Richard is a cool sword. Sir Axel has strength. Sir Godry has strength. The captain's instinct in him wanted to say the truth. Pick men who fight for you and not for themselves. Pick men who can stand in a line and not in a song. Lord Valerion has seen battle at sea. We do not fight in boats, Stannis said. No, my lord. Davos looked past him, toward the distant line of Renly's tents. It was hard to think of Loras Tyrell's men as enemies in the old sense, the way smugglers had enemies. A light on a cliff that should not have been there, a coast guard who could be tricked or not. These had faces, and the faces had names, and the names were sewn into the land. Sir Roland Storm is within Storm's End. He would fight for you if he were not sworn to keep the gate closed. Davos kept his tone flat, not making a complaint of the fact. Nothing so irritated Stannis as the truth complaining. Stannis's eyes moved sideways toward him in that way he had of noticing things as if they were numbers in a column that had been misadded. You will fight, he said. Davos's mouth was already forming the word yes, because he had made a habit of saying yes when Stannis required hard things. Yes, I will carry onions. Yes, I will lose fingers if you require it. Yes, I will carry your truth into a dark where I cannot see. But he added, because he knew the account would demand it eventually, I am no tourney sword. This is no tourney, Stannis said. You are a knight. You will fight. Davos nodded, and Stannis, having settled the number in his head, looked away again. The bastard of night song, he said, as if he were spitting out a bone. No, he is not ours to call. We have what we have. He lifted his hand toward the red woman, and she came forward like a sail catching a breeze. You have a thing to say, my lord, she said, and her voice had the low warmth of something burning well. The judgments of your green sept are of no meaning before the Lord of Light. There is no face for lies in the true fire. Let me show your brother which God answers. No, Stannis said, too quickly for it to be a new decision. No sados. The time for that will come if it must. I will not have men whispering that I took a crown from a lie because I would not trust the truth to stand. Let the 7 say what they like. They are dead wood. If they speak in your favor, it is because my God is patient. If they speak against me, I will have their measure. Melisandre's eyes had the gaze of a cat watching a firefly. The gods you despise still pull at the hearts of the men you need. I do not despise their men, Stannis said. Only their fictions. The men will see a thing with their eyes and believe it for a week. That is longer than they would believe my word. And longer than they would believe mine, Davos said before he could stop himself. Stannis's mouth made the smallest movement that might, on some men, have been a smile. He did not turn his head. Sir Axel, he said, practical again. Sir Richard, Godry, Lord Valerio, and Davos. I will have 2 more. He cut a glance toward the lesser line of men, Clayton Suggs, brutal and eager, Guncer Sunglass, pious and taut as a bowstring, Eldon Estermont, old and stubborn as Hill, porridge-faced knights with no names that would matter in the songs of those who survived. Clayton, Sunglass. Suggs grinned like a wolf just told to mind the sheep. Sunglass bowed his old head, with the haunted look of a man who believed the 7 watched him even in his sleep and wondered if they were proud or disgusted. Davos felt a tension leave him at that last choice, because Sunglass was the sort of man whose caution had a prayer in it, and these were the men he preferred in a line beside him. Let them have their roses, Stannis said. I have thorns enough. Renly named his 7 in the lantern glow of evening, for the pleasure of seeing the crowd of lords lean in, as if he were a bard come to the best part of a scandalous tale. He named Loras first, because he would, and Caitlin watched the smallest distortion pass across Loras's perfect face. Pleasure managed like a gift, and watched it be hidden again. He named Brienne next, and it surprised many and angered some. But anger is only another color of surprise, and all colors look well in lamplight. He named Rabar Royce and Bryce Karen because one had lineage to shine like silver and the other had the hard reputation of steel. He named Emin Cui because someone must carry an orange cloak into a trial by 7 for the sake of the tale, and he named Guyard Morrigan because the Raven's brother had the gravity men love to see on the field of honor, and because Renly liked the teasing of it, the black bird on his green lap. Renly named himself last, softening the nobility of the gesture by smiling privately at Caitlin over the heads of his knights, as if to say, "See, I have yet the gift of surprise." "It is folly," Loras said quietly afterward when they were alone. The candles made little domes of light on the polished wood of the table, and beyond them the tent was a low sea of shadow. "It is romance, and romance makes fools of swords." "It is necessity," Renly said, with an echo of Brienne. He turned the antlered helm in his hands, fingers running the curve of one time. "He is right, Lenny. The old stories rule these men as much as hunger does. Give them an ending the 7 can smile upon, and they will choose to lay down their arms rather than spoil a good last line. I have seen too many weddings to doubt the power of ceremony." "You have seen too many feasts," Loras said, but his voice gentled. He reached out and took the helm, set it aside like a thing that might hurt. "He fights as if the world were something to be endured. He will not tire as quickly as jesters and lovers do." Renly laughed, but there was no mock in it. "I will make him tire of me if it takes 7 days. Hush." He turned Loras's hand in his and pressed the palm to his mouth. Caitlin, when she later permitted herself to think of it, imagined she could have told them both that men make a habit of believing courage makes them immortal until they bleed. But she did not say it, because they would not have listened and because there is a pride in all men that will not let a woman's remembered grief be instruction for their bright future. She lay in a corner of the camp that night, listening to the wind worry the canvas like a hound's teeth, and tried to pray. All the prayers she could muster were questions. They did not feel like things the gods would value, but she offered them anyway, because her father had said, as he put her hand in Hoster Tully's while the bells were ringing, that the gods counted earnestness as high as eloquence. When dawn came, the light was clean as a blade. Dew grew in the grass like glass beads, and the breath of the horses steamed as if they had eaten winter. The field had been roped off. Men stood shoulder to shoulder 3 deep in a ring, as if surrounding a tail to keep it from running away. Septon Orell stood within the ring, a little out of breath from having moved too quickly to a place in the sun. His hands shook with the holy book he lifted. Behind him there had been brought a portable sept, its 7 wooden faces dark with age or oil or both. Caitlin thought of Winterfell's godswood and felt out of place among all this carved certainty. The champions stood at their places, war in a neat line. On Renly's side, Loras Tyrell, whose green armor did not shimmer so much today as drink the light. Brienne, blue and straightforward as an oath. Rabar Royce in polished bronze, the runes on his plates dark as if dipped in ink. Bryce Karen with his stark crow sigil at his shoulder. Emin Cui tall and thin, the orange silk of his cloak tied high so it would not catch in a blade. Guyard Morrigan, heavy-shouldered and still, and Renly himself, his antlers making his helm a thing one could use to hang lamplight from. On Stannis' side, Stannis Baratheon, iron and inevitability. Ser Richard Horp with his patient sword. Ser Axel Florent, whose beard bristled through the chains as if it too wanted to fight. Godry Faring, a slab of man. Lord Montford Valerion, looking slightly seasick but determined. Ser Clayton Suggs, who smiled too much. Lord Gunser Sunglass, whose lips moved continuously in a private conversation with his gods. And Davos Seaworth, whose mail had seen hard salt and whose eyes were as uneasy as any sailor's when told to love a flat field. Caitlin could not help thinking he looked most of all like a man forced to use a book as an oar. "Do you come before the 7 in truth?" Septon Orell said, blinking as sweat stung his eyes despite the morning cool. "Do you accept that judgment which the warrior permits your arms to bring and the father decrees?" "I do," said Renly, so pleasant he might have been consenting to a dance. "I do," said Stannis, so hard he might have been agreeing to a beating. "Then let it be witnessed," Septon Orell said, lifting his book, and the sunlight went through the thin pages and made of it a screen that briefly showed the letters like bones. "By the mother's mercy, by the maid's innocence, by the smith's strength, by the crone's wisdom, by the father's justice, by the warrior's courage, and under the stranger's gaze who waits for us all." They came together in a metal-ringing thunder that shivered Catelyn's teeth and made the wooden faces on the sept seem to jump. The first clash is always the lie that all the rest of it believes. That one hard coming together will decide it. It did not decide this. Swords met shields. Men slid and settled and broke apart and came on again. The champions paired with the quick intelligence of men who have done this more often than they admit to believing in gods. Loras went at Axel Florent with an elegance that was almost contempt. The first exchange showed Florent's bulk to be no defense against a blade that understood geometry. Florent staggered under Loras's shield strike, righted himself by fury, and found the boy's blade raking his gorget like rain on a roof. Loras drove, pressed, turned the man's size to his own balance's advantage, and then Axel was down on a knee and Loras's blade was a silver line, and Florent's life, such as it would be in a tale, was ended. He fell like a sack of barley and lay still. Brienne went for Godry Faring as if they had been enemies born. Godry shouted something about women and kitchens that made the men in the crowd laugh in the frightened way that you laugh when you are grateful not to be struck yet. Brienne's answer was a blow that landed on his shield like a bell. She fought like a block of mountain, an avalanche of careful stone, her blade always coming to the right place at the right time, her feet never where someone could trip them. Godry bellowed and drove and chopped and found himself continually striking where she was not, while she struck where he was. The sound of their exchange was deep as drums. Richard Horp and Bryce Caron closed and opened as if they were doors in the same house. Davos faced Emin Huey, whose blade had a reach Davos's did not. Davos learned very quickly where his lack would get him killed, and made of it something else, darting in when Huey overcommit, sliding out when the man's reach would make the difference. He took a blow on the shoulder that numbed his entire arm and thought, like a sailor counting another wave, "Keep your feet, keep your feet, keep your feet, you have nothing if you do not have your feet." Suggs met Rabar Royce and grinned until Rabar hit him in the mouth with a hard shield blow that made the grin look like the mouth of a torn fish. Then Suggs stopped grinning and began trying to kill the man in earnest. Montford Valerian and Gaillard Morrigan fell to with a grave anger that made them seem like men at a funeral fighting over who should lift the bier. Renly and Stannis met and sundered and met again, and at first it looked like theater the way both of them were so careful, Stannis testing, Renly showing. But then the lines of Renly's skirts were scuffed, and Stannis' shield showed a deep bite like a bad coin taken in a poor light, and sweat made dark streaks beneath both arms. The antlers flicked shadows across the field like birds in flight. Loras finished Axel without cruelty but without waste. He turned and surveyed the field with a neatness that would have been chilling if it had not been beautiful, like watching a cat choose which bird to catch. He chose Gunser Sunglass because the old man looked most like the thing Loras meant to make of all these men. A lesson. He drove Gunser back in 3 clean exchanges, brought a cut down that split the old lord's helm as if it were an egg, and went on, wiping his blade once across the edge of his shield in a dainty gesture that would be called art by men who never had to learn the trick. Brienne beat down Godry. The big man's strength went into the ground first, shaking it. Then his breath went out of him. Then a swing that would have opened a horse's belly whistled through clean air. Brienne's riposte landed squarely, exactly where you put a nail when you mean for a thing to hold taut forever. Godry fell as if she had cut the cord that kept him standing. He did not get up. Richard Horp's patience paid. He led Bryce Caron into a pattern that closed upon him, the sword coming again and again to the place of that small flaw in Caron's guard. Bryce was good and he was brave. It took skill to die the way he did, hard and in rhythm and looking for an escape he would not take because it would be shameful. He crumpled with a tiny sound that made Catelyn think of cloth being folded. Davos kept his feet. He had little else. He felt his right arm again. He felt the warmth of blood running from somewhere he would find later. He saw Huey's blade come like the very practical answer to a question, and he shifted his weight and let it spend itself. In that instant, Hugh's legs gave him forward balance and forward balance only. Davos, who knew all about bad momentum and how to borrow it and how to make it stop, stepped in and banged his shield into the place where Hugh's breath lived. The Orange Knight gagged. Davos's blade was already rising. The next thing was done then, and Davos looked down and found a man with orange silk wrapped around his throat like an angry flower lying still. He said a prayer he had not said in 30 years, and did not think the Seven would accept it from him, but said it anyway. Rabar, Royce, and Suggs were both bleeding. Suggs smiled again and found that his mouth no longer remembered how. Montford Valerion fell to one knee and rose and fell again, stubborn as if the sea were watching and would be ashamed if he did not keep getting back up. Guyard Morrigan's blade was steady as a metronome. He did not shout. He killed Montford with a cut as plain as bread, crisscrossed and thinned. The crow. D fell silent at last, that frightened silence that tells you men are carefully putting their fear in the place they were keeping hope. A gull wheeled overhead and cried, and the sound was so pure it scraped. Stannis and Renly came together once more broke, once more closed. Renly struck with speed, Stannis with weight. Renly turned a cut with a flourish that would have won him applause in a yard full of boys. Stannis ignored anything that was not the straightest path to the slow end of his brother's stamina. They traded shield for shield. The rim of Stannis's shield caught on one of the antlers and tore a long graze across it. For a foolish instant, Catelyn thought of hunting stags in the Wolfswood, of a stag breaking a fight with a tree and running on with half the tree on his head. Stannis did not think of trees. He dropped his shield, stepped in, and put his blade in the space Renly had not had to guard in 10 years because no one had ever made him consider it there. Renly hissed, surprised, and then his voice went calm again as if he had relearned the line. He beat Stannis back with a sudden ferocity that made the air hot around them. Stannis endured it the way he endured everything else. He took a cut on the bracer that would have opened another man's flesh. He accepted a bruise on the upper arm as he would accept attacks on a ledger that could not be avoided. He pressed forward with that terrible small economy of his, until Renly had to deal with him and only him and not with the margin of the tail. Loras, bleeding now from a neat line along his temple where Rabar's blade had finally found his impatience, extricated himself with a fury that was almost panic. Rabar looked wronged by the way the changes had come upon the day. He looked around and discovered he was in a story that did not flatter him. He saw Suggs coming in again and found in himself the wherewithal to end that story. He struck and struck until Suggs's head lolled like a broken stalk. He turned and saw Brienne standing over Godry's bulk, blue cloak darkened with sweat and something darker. He did not go to her. He went to Renly. So did Brienne. They converged, and for the smallest of instants they checked one another. Loras's eyes under his visor were bright and hard and full of a boy's certainty. Brienne's eyes were a woman's and held more than one thing at once. A memory of a kindness and a fury about an injustice. A love that had been given unasked and had made of her a creature more dangerous than she had imagined she could be. Loras moved to Renly's right. Brienne went to his left. Richard Horp arrived like the absence of flourish, and Guyard Morrigan like the presence of it. Davos, panting, did not go anywhere. He simply set himself in the place where, if he were needed, he would already be. The field tightened to a knot. Stannis and Renly drove one another into a circle of iron. Loras struck at Richard with that precise cruelty which looks like mercy in the hands of someone beautiful. Richard blocked and cut at the legs and did not look at Loras's face. He looked only at the sword. Guyard and Brienne traded a sequence of blows that would have made a schoolmaster of swords clap his hands and grin. Guyard was good enough to die for it gracefully, and Brienne was relentless enough to kill him without triumph. Rabar Royce pushed past Davos and took Stannis on the flank with a shout that had the note of a lord who expects the world to move aside. Davos moved, and his blade intercepted Rabar's with a jolt that made Davos's battered arm weep with fire. He could not have repeated what happened next to his own satisfaction later. He had done something at the level of the body that left Rabar's blade turned just enough. Stannis felt the blow from Royce's sword as a tug on his mail and not as death. He took the opening this made and put his own sword point where Renly had left himself open in making a beautiful parry. Renly took the thrust along the ribs. It bit, and his body understood. Oh, I can end here. He stepped back, and the antlers dipped and rose. The world seemed to balance suddenly on a knife's edge. Caitlin knew that feeling. It was the breath before a sentence ends. The hiss of a candle just when it decides whether to gutter out or steady. Yield, Stannis said, for once putting a note in his voice that was not iron but something hot. Yield, and I will give you Storm's End again. Yield and lay down that crown that was never yours. Renly's breath came harsh. The sound of it was a private thing, as if the two men were suddenly in a little room no one else could enter. Loras was fighting Richard with a desperation that concession steals from boys. Brienne was there, sweat running along her jawline, her mouth slightly open, her sword at guard ready to become a wall. The men around them had fallen back as if pulled by a tide. Septon Orell had forgotten to breathe, and when he remembered, he hiccuped. "Brother," Renly said. The smile came again, simply because he had lived his life with it, and he did not quite know how to let go of the tool even when the craft changed. But beneath it there was no mockery. He lifted his sword and lowered it, slowly, until the tip kissed the grass. He sank to one knee that left a dark damp mark on his greave. He set his free hand upon his knee and bowed his head. "I yield." There was a sound from the crowd like a wound going in. Then it was silenced by the look on Stannis' face. He stood there, breathing as if the day had at last acknowledged his endurance, and for a heartbeat no one moved. Loras made a noise in his throat that was not a word and not anything he would want anyone to remember. He took half a stride, but Brienne's blade was there, not threatening but present, a reminder written in steel that some decisions, once made, take time to unravel. Septon Orell found his voice and his words and did the thing for which the day had called him. "By the Judd, Gement of the Seven," he cried, and now his voice rang, fat and reedy and absolutely certain. "By the judgment of the Seven, rendered here under their faces and their witness, Renly Baratheon, late king in the south, yields his false crown, and Stannis Baratheon is declared the rightful heir of King Robert, first of his name. Let all men mark and remember. Let all men keep this peace." Men stood stunned in the place where a battle would have begun, and because they had not been asked to scream and kill in the next instant, they did not know what to do with their hands. Some reached for skins. Some crossed themselves. Some let tears run down their faces, because the body must find a way to end a fear if the story does not provide it. The Red Woman watched Stannis with a look that was half proud and half as if she had just witnessed a child taking his first step into a fire. She did not smile, her eyes were very bright. Stannis lifted his sword, placed it point down in the grass, and leaned on it for a breath in which he allowed himself to be only a man who had lived through the thing he could not escape. Then he straightened. "We are done," he said. Not to his brother, but to everyone. "Put away the pageant. We have work." Renly rose. The visor hid his face. When he lifted it, the face was no longer the one he wore for the world. It was paler and plainer, and more like the faces of men who had never been called beautiful. "Brother," he said again. "Lord of Storm's End," Stannis said, formal and without affection, as one might grant a debt owed to the dead. "Hold it for me as our father did for his king. If you hold it for another—" He did not finish. He did not need to. Renly closed his eyes for an instant, then opened them and nodded once. Loras turned then, and the look he fixed on Stannis could have cut mail. "This is a trick," he said softly, because he was not a fool and had learned the line that would be left to him. "The Seven cannot be guileless when they consent to be used. The Seven consent to whatever men decide to call their will," Stannis said, which might or might not have been more gracious than silence. Renly raised a hand slightly and Loras went still, but it was the stillness of a sword about to be drawn again later. Brienne, whose sword had not lowered during any of this, took one small step closer to Renly in a movement the eye would mistake for a draft stirring a tent flap. Caitlin watched that and thought, not for the first time, that there existed a kind of loyalty which could not be bought and could not be bullied, and she did not know whether the world had place for it. The day did not end in feasting. It ended in the industrious noise of men untangling their old ties and tying new ones, with haste and with reluctance and with ill grace and with acceptance. Renly sent riders to Storm's End before the sun had leaned even a hand's breadth west, bearing letters under his seal, written in his own hand. Men came to Stannis in reluctant lines, saying the words they had said to Renly the day before, their mouths learning them a second time in a different shape. Some storm lords had tears of rage standing in their eyes as they spoke. Some had the tears of relief. Davos watched and thought of the strange justice that would give Renly a chance to live with his decision, for once, rather than cutting it short and making a martyr of him. The Red Woman watched with her odd, intense sadness, as if all this misplaced piety were a child's game prepared for a fire she could already see. Catelyn found Renly alone in his pavilion just before dusk. The antlered helm sat on the table, its shadow stretched long and thin by the angle of the light. He sat with his shoulders slumped and his hands empty, which made him look larger and also less. "You wanted the pageant," Catelyn said. "I wanted the end the pageant promised," he said, the smile rueful and tired, letting her in on a secret he could not quite keep even now. "I wanted them to see the seven kiss me. They kissed my brother instead. And yet..." He lifted one hand and let it fall. "The realm will have less killing now. Will it? Tell me it will." "I cannot tell you that," she said. "I can tell you that men will find it harder to excuse it, which may do as much good as your pageant." He cocked his head. "You are honest in a way that must be heavy to carry." "So is your crown," she said, and he laughed. A true laugh, surprised out of him like a fish dragged from the water. He sobered at once. "Loras will not forgive this," he said. "I ask that you not hold that against him when he shows you the shape of it." "I will hold against him only what he does," she said, "not what pain does through him." "Ah," he said, and looked down at his hands. "Then you are kinder to him than he often is to himself." "Lady Stark, what do the North's gods make of 7 little men deciding such a matter?" "They smile at men counting gods," she said. "And they take the measure of what we do, not what we put a name upon. I have learned that much." He nodded. When she left, Brienne was outside. Brienne's eyes moved to Renly and back, and she bowed so that it might be understood by anyone watching that her bow was both to him and of him. Stannis called his war council and made it a council. He did not win men with charm. He won them with tasks. "Storm's End," he said, and his voice made the fortress with its drum tower walls rise in the minds of everyone present, as if it had always been waiting behind their eyes. "Lord Penrose is a loyal man, and we give thanks for that when loyalty is to us. He holds Robert's bastard, and he holds the gate, and he will not yield easily. He will yield to his lord." He looked at Renly, who met his look and did not flinch. "You will write, you will stand before the gate, you will swear by your 7, and he will yield. If he does not..." His mouth tightened. "We will take his surrender by means we do not love." Renly said quietly, "By the 7 I swore today, I will not see Lord Penrose undone by a door opened in darkness." Stannis's profile did not soften, but something in the room did. "Good," he said. "I have little love for doors I do not open myself." They went to Storm's End in a procession that had no joy in it, and came to those inhuman walls that defied both siege and metaphor. The sea crashed its approval at their side. Men whispered that impossible tales had been made here and makes itself into stone weathered by the same salt wind that flayed the skin from sailors. Renly, wearing no crown and yet surrounded by the pageant of banners that still loved him, rode to the gate. His blue-cloaked knight rode at his right with a posture that made nonsense of rumors. Davos stood by Stannis, watching the parapet, watching the small figures walking there. He had brought onions to this gate once. Onions and salt fish packed in pitch. The smell remembered him better than the men did. Courtnay Penrose's voice dropped like a stone from the height. "Your Grace," he called, and he meant Stannis by the words because he was particular about words. "You bring Storm's End its master then? I have read a hand and seen a seal, but men can be made to write many things when they are in fear of something they love." "Lord Penrose," Renly called back, steady as standing water, though Davos could hear the low tension in his breath. "I yielded my claim before the Seven. I come to yield my gate. I keep what honor I may by doing it with a voice the men can hear, and that voice says, 'Open.'" There was a long silence, the kind of silence stones maintain when considering whether to roll down a hill or remain the hill's shoulder. Then Courtnay Penrose called, "By what will the child be kept safe?" Stannis lifted his hand and the Red Woman did not move. Davos felt relief as if breathing for the first time. "By my word," Stannis said. "By my brother's memory. By the judgment given in the sight of gods you believe in, and I do not. If I break it, I am less than a man, and worse than a king. I will not break it." Courtnay Penrose's voice did not change. "Then swear it." Stannis swore it. He swore it with a care for the words that made men who loved the Seven nod despite themselves. He swore it in such a way that, when the gate began to open with a vast muttering of stone, Davos felt human pride and not the hollow triumph of having done something by night. The gate lifted. The keepers came out, with their faces set like men who have told themselves it was right and will not permit anyone to tell them otherwise. Courtnay Penrose came to Stannis like a man who knows he will be set down in a ledger and wishes the lines to be neat. He bowed. He did not kneel. The bastard child with the king's eyes was presented, not as a hostage but as a problem solved by men who were weary of being problems. Stannis took the boy's shoulder with a hand that was firm but not cruel. He looked down at the dark hair and the eyes that could not help but be something they were. "You will be kept," he said. "You will grow to manhood, and then we shall see if you are a good man or not. That is a kind of justice too." The march turned then, with Storm's End behind them not as prize but as tool. The Storm Lords who had been Renly's became Stannis's with the sullen obedience of men, who have had their say and been overruled by someone they admit must exist. Ravens went up. In the space of 2 weeks, messengers went and came, and the realm learned the word of the trial, and learned also that Renly had not died, and that made of the word something stranger than any tale. The Reach Lords who had crowded Renly's pavilions like perfume now gathered to their own tables and considered what name would make them richest. Catelyn saw Mace Tyrell's mind in the way men described his hesitation. The mouth that worked around words before saying them. The hands that touched the wine cup with affection. Loras's fury was an easy story. His mother's weather eye was a harder, more useful one. She sent quiet riders north and east. She sent other quiet riders west. There were rumors in King's Landing of a betrothal unbetrothing and of another rose being offered, more fragrant and more fatal. Tyrion Lannister, in his area of cunning, heard these rumors and made of them plans that stank of wildfire. The small folk in the city heard other rumors. That a king had knelt to a king, and that the Seven had been seen to nod. Men do not know what to make of gods when gods do not bother to be plain, and so they imagined outcomes that would make them safer. One of these outcomes was Marjorie Tyrell riding into King's Landing with roses braided into her hair and a lion at her side. Another was Stannis Baratheon riding in with his numbers doubled. His ships plowing the Blackwater with spines of oars, and a boy with an onion on his surcoat walking beside him like a conscience. The ships Stannis had were still the Florent fleet and what he could gather besides. The chain Tyrion imagined and had forged could not be unimagined when men did not know it existed. The wildfire Haleen the pyromancer had decanted under great dusty banners of the Mad King's day would burn as willingly for one king as for another. And yet all these things would meet a world in which a pageant had altered the sense of story. Men who had watched the trial by Seven told it over spiced wine to men who had not, and those men told it to others, and the tale grew the way all tales grow. It put a hand on the next thing and then the next. In some versions, Renly had died there and had risen again to kneel. In some, the Seven themselves had descended in a haze of light and pointed their fingers. In some, Stannis bled a gout of black blood which the Red Woman drank. In a few, Brienne was the maiden herself, come in a blue cloak to put things right. In none of them did any man confess to liking the part where he was frightened. The armies moved. Heralds rode ahead of them with faces set in that serious masked men wear when they do not want to be kissed or mocked. The Blackwater waited, green and sly and full of old iron. Stannis's ships smelled of tar and onion, of old wood and colder hopes. Davos stood on the deck of Black Betha and listened to the creak of planks. He trusted more than the prayers men said when they were too close to land. His sons stood on decks not more than arrow flight from him, their mouths thin with belief and fear. He had not told them to stay because he had learned too late that a man cannot hoard love like coin. He had given it to them in the only way he knew, by letting them stand where men stood when they would be counted. Renly rowed with Stannis along the causeway nearest the river rather than taking ship. It was a humble place for a man who had worn a crown, and consequently the place he had chosen. Loras, having made a tent of his rage that he lived beneath now, rode away to the west with Lord Mace, the roses on their banners darker than they should have been. Catelyn had long since left for Riverrun, because her son had battles of his own and the river would not wait for news that could not be made into bread. She rode with the sound of the sea in her ears and could not decide whether she had witnessed wisdom or just a prettier form of pride. The day of the Blackwater battle came up out of a purple dawn. The alchemists' fires lay in their jars like dreaming serpents. The chain lay under the water like a thought a man had but did not intend to use until the right time. Stannis's galleys came on in excellent order, with the quiet economy he loved, and the men on the walls muttered prayers or jokes in the tones of men who do not intend any of them to be remembered afterward. Davos's heart beat with a sailor's coolness until the first ship burst like a fruit and spilled its green entrails on the water. Then the coolness was over. Flame made a noise like 100 wedding feasts burning in echo. Men screamed and burned because screams and burning are old friends in war. Davos did what he could. Steered, shouted, counted, prayed with a mouth that had forgotten the words. The chain rose with that horrible smoothness things have that have been well made for wicked use. Ships crashed, oars churned water and then air. Men died for a king who would never know their names. Davos looked across and caught, for a heartbeat that would trouble his sleep later, sight of his eldest boy on a deck lit by unnatural green. The boy's face was beautiful in that light, which is a cruelty no god has any excuse for. The deck went up, men and all, and Davos felt the shape of the grief he would carry until the end of his days fall into him like a weight. On land, Stannis drove as if the sea's disaster were a detail someone had left out of the plan he was determined to follow. He brought his rams to the king's gate. He set men to ladders with the mechanical insistence of a man who could not believe the world would not proceed in orderly fashion if he made enough men behave. He took arrow and quarrel and still did not tire. Renly rode with him, not as a king but as a lord who had been set back into a place and meant to do it honor. Brienne fought as if the gate itself were the insult she had come to answer. The river made a line of glittering knives to their right. The city, which had given so many kings so much trouble, stood. It would have fallen, Catelyn would tell herself later, if the Tyrells had not changed the story again. They came up the Rose Road with banners like orchards, and the men in the city began to shout because they had learned again how to hope, and that is always a dangerous thing to give to cornered men. The lions rode with the roses. Between them they made a garden where nothing but iron had been expected to grow. Loras's rage found the form it needed. Tyrion Lannister found that even cunning has to choose a side, and that his side did not always thank him. The Red Woman stood on a hill far from the river and looked into a brazier and saw only the shapes of the flames she set herself. The crushing of Stannis's front did not look like a story told to children. It looked like men, most of whom did not deserve death any more than they deserved the songs they would not receive, falling and rising and trying to find in the midst of this noise a cause that had looked clean in the morning. Stannis himself had to be lifted bodily away by men who loved him enough to survive him. He fought them and the enemy indifferently, and his sword moved until it had to be taken from him by force. Renly did not run. He held the rearguard with Brienne and the handful of hard men who had learned that honor, when stripped of pageant, is only patience and pain. Loras came for Renly like the sweep of a great green wing, and for a moment the entire field paused, recognizing that this, too, had been written somewhere in men's desires. They met in the clamor. There were no antlers now. There was no crown. There were only two men who had loved and hated one another in the brief way the young can afford to, and a woman whose face was very calm, because she had learned the shape of grief long ago and had kept a space for it inside herself ever since. No songs would ever tell the words, because there were no words. The swords met. Loras's blade flicked and was turned. Renly struck and was checked. Brienne took the blow meant to open Renly from collarbone to heart, and set it aside in a neat movement that was not as impressive as anything she had done during the trial by 7 and yet mattered more. Loras's eyes were huge and full of some new knowledge. Renly lowered his sword half an inch. "I will not kill you," he said, just loud enough to be heard by the two people who needed to hear it. "I will not make a martyr of my past." Loras's breath came like tearing cloth. You could not force a man to accept mercy. He stood with that old, dangerous hunger of boys and then made a sound that was not rage and not acceptance but something more human. He turned his horse, struck at another man instead, and led the roses deeper into the day. When it was finished, when the river's stink of burned pitch and flesh lay under the sweetness of the perfumed carts that came behind the victors, Davos crawled out of the belly of the Blackwater with oil in his lungs and eyes that did not yet understand light. He found Stannis in a darkness that had nothing to do with night, and he put his hand, which lacked fingers, on the arm of a man who had never learned how to lose and was being made to learn it now. Renly came and did not say he was sorry, because there are insults you cannot risk and compass at the same time. He said, "Brother." And that was enough, because in that word there was all of the ledger of their lives. They retreated to Dragonstone with the honor of men who have been beaten and have chosen not to kiss it as if it were their lover. The Red Woman spoke to Stannis of glories yet to come if he would only permit her God to take more and more of the world. Stannis listened as he would listen to a sailor promising a wind he could not produce. Davos buried a son at sea, which is to say he stood looking at a place where the sea looks like it is not moving, and he told himself the boy was in a better place because men require that story in order to live. Brienne went with Renly to Storm's End and stood with him on the high wall where the wind labors like a massive animal. And she taught him by her unflinching presence that there is a way to live with the end of a dream that is not surrender and not denial but something else that might be called service. Catelyn came to Riverrun and found that wisdom anywhere is purchased at the same price, with things you cannot have back. She wrote to Robb and did not lie to him. She told him that men had tried a thing that once worked in stories and had learned that stories only give you a way to get through some days, not all. Robb wrote back and said that the river had its own opinion and would not be quieted by anyone's pageant. She smiled at that, because the boy she had born had discovered that rivers, like men, have to be negotiated with, not commanded. In the quiet between storms, men told one another the tale of the trial by 7 at Storm's End. In the telling, they made it cleaner and made themselves braver. They told how the 7 had looked down and nodded. They told how the blue-cloaked knight had stood in the place where destiny had decided to walk and had made room for it. They told how one brother had yielded to another and had not died. And they took comfort from that, because most stories do not let men yield and live. The Red Woman told Stannis another story at night, looking into coals, that he was Azor Ahai reborn, and that all these pageants of the 7 were tinder waiting to be used by the true flame. Stannis listened to her with the grave attention. He gave everything that required his discipline and gave her his answer by the way he did not call for shadows. The 7, who may or may not have eyes, watched men move like light in the wind. Winter marched. The river drank banners. The Game of Thrones bent itself to the old shape and then broke that shape again. The trial by 7 remained in the realm like a tale that had once almost turned the war another way, and that was something. There are days when stories change outcomes and days when they only change what men call outcomes when they drink. Renly learned the habit of keeping his hands empty in council, because empty hands remind a man to speak with his head. Loras learned to live alongside a blown ember he could not smother, and he made of it heat for the work his mother and grandfather taught him. Davos learned his prayers again, and he said them to all gods and to none, because a man who has lost a son cannot afford to be particular. Catelyn slept sometimes with her eyes open in case a story came to tell her how to save her other children. When no story came, she rose and did the things that could be done without grace and without reward. When men met on fields in the years to come, there were moments when they would pause before the blow and, in the pause, remember a morning's clean light upon dew-beaded grass, and a Septon's voice, and a king setting his blades tip into the earth to breathe. Some would call it folly. Some would call it faith. All would call it human, which is a worse insult and a greater honor than anything any god can contrive. And upon the high black stones of Dragonstone, where fires burned and winds wrapped the walls like restless thoughts, a man who had put his honor in a fight and lost later battles kept his eyes upon the doing of the next task. The ledger of the realm still wanted balancing. The world would never do it for him. He put his head down and did sums as if they would answer. In the end, the story a man tells himself is the only one that gets him through a night, and sometimes, if enough men tell themselves the same story, the morning is better than it would have been. That, too, is a kind of magic. The seven do not need to be true for that, nor does any other god. Men do.